Happy New Year, everybody. And who was the little boy? What's his name again? Leo. He did very well during meditation. Okay. And as Jesus said, suffer little children to come unto me. I wonder what went into their brains when they were sitting around him at that time, what seeds were sown. It's amazing to think about it. Well, today's topic is the law of grace. And if you were here when Reverend Grace Merrick gave her talk here, or class in the afternoon, she asked us what was grace. We had a rather rambunctious lot at that class. And of course, me, being the perfect student, said, oh, it's what God gives freely. And she said, very good. And then I said, but it's also something you say before lunch. Then Jenny said, also for dinner. And Grace threw her hands up. But we all said, welcome to Melbourne. But it was a great time, and we've got a year full of all this to happen again. But what is grace? Well, simple one. Grace is God's love in action. But it also comes from the Greek word charis, which means to give of itself, that which is given freely. To give it, just give it. Whether we consciously or know it or not, we have it. Grace is what we are. Now, we don't need an excuse for grace. Everything is here. And I have to say that it was awkward getting this talk together this week. Everything stopped it from happening. So I've abandoned hope, and I just think that the right things will need to be said. Has anyone not felt grace? Has anyone got an experience of grace? That'll do. Very fitting, yes, Grace. Your middle name is Grace, okay. Anyone else? Just short and sweet, before I get into it. I don't want it to be all about me, but I've had very many moments of grace. And I think one of the big ones was, I may have said this one before, but in Camberwell, the shopping centre there, you're up high and you can look out and you can see the city. And it was a busy time in the afternoon, about 5 o'clock. And the sun was just coming across in the evening. And there's the Rialto. And I started looking, I think, my goodness, there's going to be a point in time where that sun is going to look as if it's sitting right on top of the Rialto building. Now, it wasn't only me that thought that. There were about 4 or 5 of us. Nothing was said. We were all sort of lingering at this point. We were watching as people were coming and going, not even aware of what we were waiting for. Then all of a sudden, for one brief moment, the sun stood on top of the Rialto. Everyone looked at each other and we got goosebumps. It was a wonderful feeling. But why at that particular time, where only 5 of us that I was aware of could see it? Yet grace is around us all the time. We know when we see a rainbow, they're quite common, but at certain times you think, yeah, look at that, that is amazing. And if you look closely, there might be 2 or 3. So to learn about grace, we have to sort of be aware of who we are and live our life. I've used the term here before, you don't get to heaven by betraying the earth. If we've got things we have to live and do, we do them. There's really no right or wrong here, but we suffer when we don't act in with divine law. Divine law can't be broken. And so we know if we eat too much, we get too fat, or all that sort of business. We suffer. But through that suffering, something happens. We are made still. We are made to sit down, do nothing, and rest. And that's how that inner voice, that inner grace imparts to us, that we are more than just the physical body. We're on a soul's journey throughout eternity. So we can learn about grace by looking at its opposite. If we do something wrong by the law, we're a person non grata. We're a person without grace. And if we behave unsocially, as some of us have done from time to time, we're a disgrace to society. So if we behave like that, disgrace, it has its opposite, which I'm going to talk about. What comes up must come down eventually. God in us gives to us grace. It's already there. It will be revealed when we're ready. Be still and know that I am God. We've heard this Bible verse many, many times. And as I said before, the 23rd Psalm is a psalm of grace. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. My cup runneth over. Why does it take going against the law for us to learn? Well, that's what it takes sometimes. It's not always the way. But, as I said, if you do what you have to do and suffer the consequences, like the prodigal son, you think it's time to go home. Whereas the other son who stayed home was quite jealous when the father brought out the calf and all this sort of stuff. Could it have been that that son was really holding it in and he was trying to be good in his father's eyes, but secretly harboured jealousy for his older son who went out and spent his fortune but was welcomed back as if nothing had happened? That's what Spirit's like with us. We welcome back. In his book, Celebrate Yourself, Eric Butterworth puts it this way. God's will is another confused religious term, the understanding of which will help us to understand grace. The will of God is the ceaseless longing of the Creator to fulfill himself in and as that which he has created. This will, or creative intention, is so great that it seeps through one's willfully closed mind. What a way to put it. Now some examples. The English scientist Isaac Newton, who was born in 1642, was sitting in, I think he was in his bath or something. Now, who was that? Someone was in their bath and they wondered why the water was swirling. This Archimedes. Well, this is after Archimedes. He saw an apple fall and said, now, why does it fall? Why is it falling downwards? Why not upwards, to the right or to the left? Why always downwards? And in answer to that question, the law of gravity. He discovered it. He didn't invent it, as one book claims, but it had been revealed to his consciousness. Now, we know apples have been dropping forever, but it took one person to question this and to find out the law of gravity. And as we know, physical life drags us down, as we only know too well. But to counteract this, we have the law of grace, which can lift our spirit up, expand our spirit. So our physical bodies fall downwards, as our physical bodies fall downwards, as our spiritual body falls upwards. Now, in the Bible, it says, "No man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven." And I was going to leave it there, but I did add the next bit, "even the Son of Man which is in heaven." So here we are, and in us we have the seeds of divinity. But the paradox is we came from heaven to experience this, our consciousness of our divinity, and then the body served its time, and our spirit expands and rises. Now, at the end of Isaac Newton's life, in 1725, we read of another Newton, and at the end of John Newton, his name is, 2 years before his namesake's passing. He was born a devout Christian, but like the prodigal son, he went his own way. So disgraceful was his behaviour that he was a soldier of fortune, you name it, he was into it. He was in the Navy for a while, but he was disgraced and put in irons and publicly humiliated. And somewhere along the line, he came across a book called The Imitation of Christ. Now, I found my old copy. Makes absolutely no sense to me when I was younger, and it really doesn't make much sense now. But I just opened it up the other day, and it said, God's grace and worldly wisdom do not mix. Now, worldly wisdom is our man-made laws, and they're right in some country, they're not even accepted in other countries. But divine law is always divine law. So later, and still unrepentant, he became a captain of a ship that was transporting slaves amongst the colonies. However, one day he had a shocking experience, and a ship like that on the sea, and it was waterlogged, and he thought, this is it. He came face to face with his own immortality. However, him and the ship were saved, but it changed his life forever. He gave up his slave business, and he came under the influence of Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, the founders of Methodism, and later became a very devout minister. We remember him today as the composer of the famous hymn, Amazing Grace. Now, in that hymn is a line. What's going on over there? All right, you behaving yourself? Eh? Okay. Wonder what he said. Anyway, in that hymn, there's a line which a lot of people don't like. Amazing grace that saved a wretch like me. Now, in our Unity book, we've unitised it. We saved a soul like me. But he wasn't writing about anyone else but himself. And there are times when we feel like a wretch. There's shocking times we have here in this physical world of its ups and downs. But here again, the other side came, the blessing. In the Beatitudes, Jesus states, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we're mourning about the death of someone. And I think we find now that most people celebrate the life of someone on their passing. It's interesting to know that funeral services, I was chatting to someone, funeral services are for the people that don't understand about that person, and yet a celebration is for the people that left over to enjoy the legacy of that person, a memorial service, and we're seeing more and more the most wonderful outdoor memorial services. All sorts of creative things are happening. So, in our metaphysical interpretation, as we grow spiritually, we can, on reflection, look back and see the effect of our thoughts that we've had on other people. And when we think what some of our actions have had, we do feel wretched and terrible. And this grief we've caused now becomes part of our grief. But we are comforted eventually by our higher self. If we learn the lesson, that's the next step. John Newton was willing to change, and he accepted God's forgiveness. He didn't keep condemning himself because he felt the power of the law of amazing grace. I'd like to do a talk soon on the mystical aspect of poetry. And Shakespeare, Sonnet 29. Shakespeare, of course, was a very spiritual writer when you think about it. And a sonnet, I believe it's 14 lines in iambic pentameter. Is that right? Pentameter? It's a way you write. It's a very special way of writing which has its own rhythm. Same as with music. Composers hear music, but they have to bring it down into a language we can understand. So when Shakespeare refers to one particular thing here, I'll read it to you and see what you think. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I alone besweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at the break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, then I scorn to change my state with kings. A poem of grace, if you can see it there. So to sum up, it is our Father's, our Creator's good pleasure to give us everything. We've got it. Joel Goldsmith, who originally was with Christian Science and went his own way and said, you don't have to ask for anything. You've already got it. And his writings, like lots of mystical writers, they change as you go on. As your consciousness change, you read it a different way. No one's ever apologised for that sort of thing. So we have the power to create, and we take the consequences of our creation. Divine law cannot be broken. The old law, the law of cause and effect, an eye for an eye. In the Ten Commandments, there's that masculine intellectual approach. But in the New Testament, consciousness creeps through. Blessed are ye. Blessed assurance. If you've learnt the lesson, the gift of grace can cancel it out. You've learnt the lesson, change your thinking, change your mind, because that is being creative. So with this in mind, let's be more conscious to opening ourselves, body, mind and spirit, to the power of amazing grace. Thank you.